You can taste the desperation in the air before you even see the lights. The descent into sublevel 97 begins at a corroded service lift that hasn't seen maintenance in 3 generations. The operator's augmetic eye clicks and whirs as he examines the throne gelt in my palm, his flesh fingers counting coins that represent 2 weeks of back-breaking labor in the corpse starch processing plants. The lift groans downward through layers of industrial decay, past forgotten substations where servitors mindlessly tend to machines whose original purpose died with the tech priests who built them centuries ago. I am Tharn Yorick, and I have made a choice that will hollow me out from the inside. The gambling den reveals itself gradually, like a wound opening in the hive's flesh. First comes the distant hum of conversation, then the electronic chimes of gaming machines, and finally the overwhelming sensory assault of the gilded grocs. The establishment occupies what was once a factory floor, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows thick with low-stick smoke and the bitter incense burned to mask the smell of unwashed bodies and fear sweat. Neon signs flicker in high Gothic script across the walls, promising fortune to those bold enough to test their luck against the house. The irony tastes metallic on my tongue. In the Underhive, luck is a luxury none can afford, yet here we gather like moths drawn to a flame that will surely consume us. The clientele divides itself into distinct strata, as rigid as the hive's social hierarchy. At the gaming tables nearest the entrance, workers like myself clutch plastic chips worth a day's wages, our hands trembling with the adrenaline of risking everything on a single throw of the dice. These are the desperate ones, the factory workers whose bodies are failing, the scribes whose positions are being automated away, the ex-guard veterans whose service pensions were cut during the latest austerity measures imposed by the planetary governor. Deeper in the den, past a checkpoint manned by enforcers whose carapace armor bears the scars of countless brawls, sit the mid-tier tables where foremen and shift supervisors gamble with monthly salaries. Their faces carry the particular tension of those who have something substantial to lose but lack the resources to play with true recklessness. They bet conservatively, nursing drinks that cost more than most underhivers see in a week, watching the dice with the intensity of men whose wives and children sleep in hab blocks that could be repossessed if the night goes poorly. But it is in the private rooms, behind reinforced doors guarded by men whose augmetic limbs could crush a human skull like an egg, where the real stakes are wagered. Here, merchant princes bet the deeds to entire factory complexes against shipping contracts that could feed a subsector. Noble houses risk centuries-old bloodlines on games whose rules shift according to the whims of dealers whose loyalty can be purchased with promises of power that span generations. The architecture itself reflects this hierarchy. The common gaming floor spreads across rust-stained ferrocrete, its surfaces worn smooth by the passage of countless desperate souls. Overhead, suspended galleries provide elevated seating for those with credits to spare, their occupants looking down upon the masses like predators selecting prey. Higher still, enclosed viewing boxes allow the truly wealthy to observe the proceedings while remaining safely removed from the stench of desperation that permeates the lower levels. I approach a chance wheel table where a dozen other workers have gathered, our collective wages pooled into a modest stake that might, if the Emperor shows mercy, multiply enough to change our circumstances. The dealer is a thin man whose cybernetic implants suggest former service in the administratum, his movements precise and mechanical as he spins the great wheel whose segments bear the icons of various imperial saints. The wheel itself is a masterwork of psychological manipulation. Each segment displays a different holy symbol, connecting the act of gambling with imperial faith in a way that makes wagering feel like prayer. The Aquila, symbol of the Emperor's divine will, occupies the largest segment and pays the smallest odds. The smaller segments bearing the marks of obscure saints promise greater returns, but represent gambles so desperate that even contemplating them feels like heresy. As the wheel spins, I study the faces around the table. There is Mika Sorensen, whose augmetic leg was fitted after a conveyor belt accident that the overseers ruled was her own fault. The medical debt from the surgery has kept her family in indentured servitude for 7 years, and tonight she gambles her daughter's food rations on the chance that luck might break their chains. Beside her stands Jorik Vandos, a former Vox operator whose hearing was destroyed by feedback during a particularly brutal shift in the communications bunker. His disability pension was cut last month when new regulations deemed his condition non-service related, and the desperation in his eyes suggests this is his final attempt to avoid the homeless shelters that double as recruitment centers for the most dangerous factory positions. The wheel slows, its clicking growing more deliberate as it approaches its final destination. The small crowd around the table holds its collective breath, and in that moment of suspension, I realize that we are not gambling with credits or even with our futures. We are wagering our souls against the possibility that somewhere in this corrupt and decaying galaxy, justice might still exist. The wheel stops on the mark of St. Celestine, a middle-tier payout that returns our stake with a modest profit. The relief around the table is palpable but temporary. We have bought ourselves another few weeks of survival, nothing more. The house has allowed us this small victory because it understands that hope is the most addictive substance of all. But even as I pocket my share of the winnings, I can feel the den's influence taking hold. The lights seem brighter, the ambient noise more welcoming, and the possibility of returning tomorrow night begins to crystallize in my mind with disturbing clarity. This is how addiction begins, not with a catastrophic loss, but with a small win that makes the next gamble seem reasonable. I move deeper into the establishment, past tables where more sophisticated games are played. Here, cards bearing the faces of Imperial heroes are shuffled and dealt according to rules so complex that understanding them requires education most underhivers will never receive. The players at these tables wear better clothes and speak in the measured tones of those accustomed to wielding authority in their daily lives, but their eyes carry the same haunted quality that marks all who frequent this place. A commotion near the center of the gaming floor draws my attention. A crowd has gathered around a table where a game called Imperial Roulette is being played. The setup resembles the ancient Terra gambling device, but the wheel has been modified to incorporate elements of Imperial doctrine. Instead of numbers, each slot bears the name of a different world within the sector, and players bet on which planets will be selected for tribute increases, military conscription, or industrial requisitioning in the coming fiscal year. The game is particularly popular among those with connections to the planetary administration, as inside knowledge of upcoming policy changes can provide significant advantages. But tonight, something has gone wrong. A young man in the uniform of a junior clerk is arguing with the dealer, his voice rising above the ambient noise as he accuses the house of manipulating the wheel's mechanism. The enforcer who approaches the table moves with the fluid grace of a trained killer. His uniform bears no insignia, but the way other patrons unconsciously clear a path for him suggests a reputation built on violence efficiently applied. When he places his hand on the clerk's shoulder, the young man's protests die in his throat. What follows is a masterclass in intimidation. The enforcer speaks so quietly that only those immediately around the table can hear his words, but the clerk's face drains of color with each syllable. By the time the conversation ends, the young man is nodding vigorously and reaching into his pockets to produce additional credits, apparently to cover some debt or fine that has been imposed for his disruption. As the clerk hurries away, I catch a glimpse of his face and recognize the particular despair of someone who has just realized that the system is not merely unfair but actively malevolent. He came here hoping that chance might provide what hard work and honest service never could, only to discover that even chance has been corrupted by those who profit from others' desperation. The incident serves as a reminder that the Gilded Grox operates under its own laws, ones that supersede any notion of imperial justice or fair play. The enforcers are not here to maintain order in any conventional sense, but to ensure that the house's profits remain undisturbed. Players who win too consistently find themselves barred from the premises or, in extreme cases, simply disappear into the maze of service tunnels that honeycomb the underhive's lower levels. I make my way to the bar, where drinks are served by a woman whose scarred hands and blank expression suggest a past that included time in one of the hive's correctional facilities. The alcohol is cheap synthetic ethanol flavored with chemical additives that burn the throat and cloud the mind, but it serves its purpose of lowering inhibitions and making increasingly desperate wagers seem reasonable. While nursing my drink, I observe the more exclusive areas of the establishment. Elevated walkways connect private gaming rooms, where the truly wealthy conduct their business away from the scrutiny of lesser mortals. Through occasional glimpses past partially open doors, I catch sight of games being played with stakes that would beggar entire hab blocks. In one room, a group of merchant princes appears to be wagering shipping contracts against mining rights, with each hand of cards potentially shifting the economic balance of power across multiple worlds. The players treat billion credit decisions with the casual indifference of men for whom such sums represent mere tokens in games played for the thrill of competition rather than financial necessity. Another room hosts what appears to be a more sinister form of gambling entirely. The participants are dressed in the robes of various imperial cults, and their game involves the selection of which citizens from specific hab blocks will be chosen for religious purification ceremonies. The winners apparently gain the right to select individuals from their rivals' territories for examination by the ecclesiarchy, a process that historically results in disappearances and property confiscations that enrich the accusers. The realization that human lives are being wagered as casually as credits sends a chill through my spine that has nothing to do with the recycled air circulating through the den's atmosphere processors. This is gambling elevated to its most obscene extreme, where the suffering of innocence becomes entertainment for those wealthy enough to treat existence itself as a game. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the gradual recognition that every patron in this establishment, regardless of their social station or the size of their stakes, shares the same fundamental delusion. We all believe that we are different, that our particular combination of skill, knowledge, or divine favor will allow us to beat a system specifically designed to separate us from everything we value. The mathematical reality is inescapable. Every game in the Gilded Grox is calibrated to ensure that the house maintains a statistical advantage over time. No amount of strategy or luck can overcome the fundamental fact that the odds are engineered to favor the establishment. Yet here we sit, each convinced that we will be the exception to this rule. As the evening progresses, the atmosphere in the den grows increasingly charged. Winners clutch their earnings with the paranoid intensity of those who know their fortune could evaporate with a single bad decision. Losers stare at empty glasses and depleted credit sticks, their faces reflecting the dawning awareness that they have sacrificed something irreplaceable in pursuit of an impossible dream. The sound of a bell ringing from somewhere deeper in the establishment draws attention toward the rear of the gaming floor. A new arrival has entered through a private entrance, his entourage of bodyguards and attendants marking him as someone of considerable importance. The crowd parts respectfully as he makes his way toward the high-stakes area, but there is something in the way other patrons avoid meeting his gaze that suggests his reputation extends beyond mere wealth. This is Caster Vex, a name spoken in whispers throughout the mid-hive levels, where he conducts his legitimate business as a supplier of industrial chemicals to the manufacturing plants that form the backbone of the hive's economy. But those same whispers carry darker rumors about his involvement in the slave trade that provides workers for the most dangerous positions in the radioactive zones where few volunteers can be found. Vex's presence transforms the atmosphere of the den in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations become more muted, laughter dies more quickly, and the staff move with the heightened alertness of those who understand that a single misstep could have consequences extending far beyond their employment at this establishment. I watch as he is escorted to a private room where a game is already in progress, its participants apparently having been waiting for his arrival. Through the briefly opened door, I glimpse a table set with playing pieces that seem to glow with their own internal light, suggesting materials and craftsmanship beyond anything available to common citizens. The game they are preparing to play is rumored to be called Imperial Conquest, a strategic simulation where players control the resources of entire star systems in a competition that mirrors the actual political maneuvering taking place in the real galaxy. The stakes are said to correspond directly to actual business dealings, with the outcome of each session determining the distribution of contracts, trade routes, and political favors among the participants. But even as I strain to observe more of their activities, I am reminded of my own purpose here. The small winnings from the chance wheel table burn in my pocket like a physical weight, and the temptation to risk them on increasingly ambitious wagers grows stronger with each passing moment. This is the true insidious nature of the gambling den's psychological manipulation. It does not rely on dramatic losses to create addiction, but rather on the gradual erosion of judgment that comes with small successes. Each modest win becomes justification for slightly larger risks, until the gambler finds himself wagering sums that would have seemed unthinkable when he first walked through the establishment's doors. I return to the gaming floor with the intention of making one more modest wager before departing for the night, but as I approach the tables, I notice that the games themselves seem to have evolved during my absence. The chance wheel now features additional segments offering even more generous payouts. The card games have introduced side bets that promise quick profits for those brave enough to take additional risks, and new forms of gambling have appeared at tables that were empty earlier in the evening. This constant evolution of options ensures that no patron ever exhausts the establishment's ability to offer fresh temptations. As soon as one form of gambling begins to feel familiar and manageable, new variations appear to challenge that comfort and draw players into unfamiliar territory where their hard-won experience provides no protection against poor decisions. I select a table where a game called Ecclesiarchy's Blessing is being played. The rules are simple enough that a new player can understand them quickly, but the betting structure includes enough complexity to ensure that calculating true odds requires mathematical skills beyond those possessed by most participants. Players purchase cards representing various imperial saints and attempt to assemble combinations that correspond to actual religious festivals and holy days. The more obscure the saint and the more specific the religious observance, the greater the potential payout. But the deck is structured so that the most valuable combinations require cards that are distributed with carefully calculated rarity. As I take my seat at the table, I realize that the other players represent a cross-section of imperial society that would never interact under normal circumstances. A former Imperial Guard sergeant sits beside a scribe from the administratum, who in turn shares the table with a tech adept whose mechanical appendages click softly as he manipulates his cards. The diversity of backgrounds creates an illusion of equality that is deeply seductive. Here, at this table, the accident of birth and the rigid hierarchies of imperial society seem temporarily suspended. Success depends only on understanding the rules and making correct decisions, not on hereditary privilege or institutional connections. But this illusion dissolves quickly as play progresses. The former sergeant's military pension provides him with enough credits to play conservatively, folding when the odds turn against him and staying in the game longer than those of us whose resources are more limited. The scribe's administrative background gives him advantages in calculating probabilities and recognizing the patterns that govern card distribution. Most significantly, the tech adept's augmetic enhancements include cognitive processing improvements that allow him to track which cards have been played with superhuman accuracy. His success rate is not dramatically higher than what skill alone might produce, but the small edge provided by his mechanical enhancements accumulates over time into a significant advantage. This disparity in capabilities means that while we all technically play the same game under identical rules, our chances of success are anything but equal. The illusion of fair competition masks a reality where systemic advantages determine outcomes more reliably than any individual decision made during play. Despite these disadvantages, I find myself drawn deeper into the game's rhythm. The mechanics of card selection and betting create a meditative state where the constant stream of small decisions crowds out larger concerns about the wisdom of my presence here. Each hand becomes its own self-contained universe where the only considerations that matter are the cards in my hand and the credits in my stake. Hours pass without my awareness of their passage. The den's lighting system is specifically designed to obscure the distinction between day and night, creating an eternal present where time becomes meaningless. The absence of chronometers or windows means that players lose track of how long they have been gambling, a disorientation that contributes to increasingly poor decision-making as fatigue accumulates. When I finally check my credit balance, I discover that my modest winnings from the chance wheel have grown into a sum that represents nearly a month's wages. The euphoria of this success is overwhelming, flooding my system with chemicals that make rational thought nearly impossible. This is the crucial moment in every gambler's journey, the point where mathematical probability collides with psychological vulnerability. The smart decision is to leave immediately, taking my winnings and never returning to this place of engineered temptation. But the chemicals flooding my brain interpret this success as evidence of some special quality that sets me apart from the countless others who have lost everything within these walls. Instead of departing, I move to a higher stakes table where the minimum bet equals my hourly wage at the corpse starch plant. The game here is called Heretic's Gambit, a name that should have served as sufficient warning about its nature. Players purchase cards representing various crimes against imperial doctrine and attempt to build the most comprehensive catalogue of heresies without including any combination that would actually trigger execution under ecclesiastical law. The game requires intimate knowledge of imperial doctrine and the subtle distinctions between various forms of forbidden belief. Too conservative an approach results in low scores and minimal payouts. Too aggressive a strategy risks assembling combinations that correspond to actual capital crimes, resulting in immediate loss of all stakes and potential attention from authorities who monitor the establishment for signs of genuine seditious activity. The other players at this table are clearly more sophisticated gamblers, their clothing and bearing suggesting comfortable middle-class backgrounds that provide them with the education necessary to navigate the game's complex theological requirements. Their conversation reveals familiarity with obscure points of doctrine that require years of study to master. As play progresses, I realize that I am hopelessly outmatched. My knowledge of imperial theology extends only to the basic catechisms taught to factory workers to ensure minimal compliance with religious obligations. The subtle distinctions between acceptable and forbidden beliefs that form the game's foundation are entirely beyond my comprehension. But rather than acknowledge this disadvantage and retreat to more suitable entertainment, I find myself increasing my bets in an attempt to compensate for lack of skill with sheer audacity. This is the gambler's fallacy in its purest form, the belief that bold action can overcome systematic disadvantages through force of will alone. The predictable result is a steady erosion of my winnings as I make increasingly desperate attempts to remain competitive with players whose advantages in education and experience are insurmountable. Within 2 hours, my remarkable success at the Ecclesiarchy's blessing table has been completely reversed, and I am betting credits that represent my next week's food budget on combinations of heretical beliefs that I barely understand. The mathematics of my situation are brutally clear. I am playing a game whose rules I do not fully comprehend against opponents with systematic advantages, using resources I cannot afford to lose. Yet the psychological momentum of the evening has created a state of mind where these obvious facts become irrelevant beside the possibility that the next hand might restore my fortunes. This dissociation from reality is the gambling den's most powerful tool for extracting wealth from its patrons. By creating an environment where normal risk assessment becomes impossible, the establishment ensures that even intelligent individuals will make decisions that they would recognize as irrational under any other circumstances. As my losses mount, I become aware of subtle changes in the behavior of the staff around my table. The dealer's movements become more attentive, and a server appears offering complimentary drinks with unusual frequency. This increased attention is not a reward for my patronage, but rather recognition that I have entered the psychological state where the most profitable extraction of resources becomes possible. The complimentary alcohol serves to further impair my judgment while creating a sense of obligation to continue playing. The heightened service makes me feel valued and important, emotions that provide temporary relief from the growing awareness of my deteriorating financial situation. When I finally exhaust my available credits, a well-dressed man approaches the table and introduces himself as a customer service representative. His offer is presented as a courtesy extended to valued patrons, a temporary credit advance secured against future wages that will allow me to continue playing until my luck improves. The terms of this loan are complex enough to obscure their true nature. The interest rates are described in language that makes them sound reasonable, and the repayment schedule is structured to seem manageable when measured against weekly rather than monthly income. Only careful mathematical analysis would reveal that accepting this credit represents a commitment to years of debt servitude. But mathematical analysis is precisely what my current mental state makes impossible. The combination of alcohol, fatigue, emotional stress, and the sunk cost fallacy that makes abandoning my existing losses feel like admitting defeat has reduced my decision-making capability to its most primitive level. I sign the documents and accept the credit advance, telling myself that this represents a temporary solution that will be resolved as soon as my fortunes improve. This rationalization allows me to avoid confronting the reality that I have just committed myself to a form of economic slavery that may persist for the remainder of my working life. With my new credit balance, I move to yet another table where the stakes are higher and the potential rewards more substantial. This game is called Planetary Roulette, and its premise involves wagering on which worlds within the sector will be selected for various forms of Imperial attention. Players bet on outcomes ranging from increased taxation to military conscription to complete orbital bombardment. The game's appeal lies in its connection to actual events that affect millions of lives. Winners can claim not only financial rewards but also the satisfaction of having correctly predicted the fates of entire populations. This element of real-world consequence adds an intensity to the gambling experience that purely abstract games cannot provide. But this connection to reality also means that the game attracts players with access to inside information about Imperial policy decisions. Military officers, administrative clerks, and ecclesiarchy officials use their positions to gain advantages that make competition by ordinary citizens fundamentally unfair. As I take my seat at the planetary roulette table, I notice that several of the other players wear uniforms or insignia that mark them as government employees. Their confident betting patterns suggest knowledge that extends far beyond what public information sources would provide. Despite this obvious disadvantage, I find myself caught up in the excitement of wagering on events that will shape the fate of billions of Imperial citizens. The ability to participate, however peripherally, in decisions of such magnitude creates an intoxicating sense of power and importance. My bets grow larger as the evening progresses, fueled by the combination of desperation to recover my losses and the grandiose fantasies that the game's premise encourages. I am no longer Tharn Yorick, corpse starch factory worker. I am a player in the great game of Imperial politics, my decisions carrying weight that extends across star systems. This delusion of grandeur is carefully cultivated by the establishment's design. The elevated stakes and cosmic scope of the games create psychological states where ordinary limits seem petty and restrictive. Players begin to identify with the powerful figures they are emulating, losing sight of their actual circumstances in favor of fantasies of unlimited potential. The inevitable result is an acceleration of poor decision-making as players risk increasingly large sums on outcomes they have no realistic hope of predicting. The house's advantage, already overwhelming in purely mathematical terms, becomes even more pronounced as psychological factors eliminate whatever small chance, skill, and analysis might have provided. When the final results are announced for the evening's planetary roulette session, I have wagered and lost credits equivalent to 3 months of factory wages. My debt to the establishment now represents a sum that will require years of payments to resolve, assuming I can maintain steady employment and avoid any additional expenses beyond basic survival needs. But the true horror of my situation extends beyond mere financial calculations. The debt contract I signed includes provisions that allow the establishment to collect payment through alternative means if monetary settlements become impossible. These alternatives include assignment of my labor to projects selected by the house, forfeiture of possessions up to and including housing, and transfer of debt obligations to family members in cases where the primary debtor becomes unable to fulfill their commitments. In essence, I have not merely incurred a financial obligation but have placed myself and potentially my entire family under the control of an organization whose profit margins depend on the systematic exploitation of those trapped within its web of debt and dependency. The recognition of what I have done strikes me with the force of a physical blow. The excitement and grandiosity that characterized the evening's gambling evaporate, leaving only the cold mathematical reality of obligations I cannot possibly fulfill through honest labor. As I sit at the now empty table, surrounded by the debris of my financial destruction, I begin to understand the true nature of the Gilded Grocs and similar establishments throughout the Underhive. They are not entertainment venues but rather processing centers designed to convert human desperation into profit for those who own and operate them. Every aspect of their operation, from the psychological manipulation of lighting and sound to the carefully calculated odds of each game, serves the single purpose of extracting maximum value from patrons while creating systems of long-term dependency that ensure continued revenue streams. The gambling den does not want players to win large amounts and depart permanently. Such outcomes represent lost opportunities for extended profit extraction. Instead, the establishment seeks to create populations of semi-permanent debtors who return repeatedly in futile attempts to resolve obligations that have been deliberately structured to remain unpayable. This business model transforms gambling addiction from a personal failing into a systemic tool of social control. Citizens who might otherwise organize to demand better working conditions or challenge the arbitrary authority of their superiors instead find themselves trapped in cycles of debt servitude that consume all available time and energy. The few patrons who do achieve significant winnings serve as living advertisements that maintain the illusion of possibility for others. Their success stories circulate through the Underhive like religious myths, inspiring countless others to risk everything on the chance that they too might transcend their circumstances through a combination of skill and fortune. But these winners represent carefully calculated losses that the house absorbs as necessary marketing expenses. For every visible success story, hundreds of others vanish into debt, servitude, or simply disappear when their obligations become unmanageable and their utility as revenue sources is exhausted. As dawn approaches, marked only by subtle changes in the artificial lighting that serves as the den's substitute for natural illumination, the establishment begins its daily transition between operational modes. The high-stakes tables close as their wealthy patrons depart for whatever legitimate business occupies their daylight hours. The common gaming floor contracts as staff redirect their attention toward maintenance and preparation for the next evening's activities. But the debt processing operations continue around the clock. In basement offices beneath the main gaming floor, clerks and accountants calculate interest payments, schedule collection activities, and update the files that track each debtor's remaining value to the organization. I am escorted to one of these offices where a tired-looking administrator reviews the terms of my obligation and explains the payment options available to resolve my account. The figures he presents make clear that conventional monetary payments will require decades to complete, even assuming perfect compliance with the minimum required amounts. Alternative arrangements are presented as acts of mercy that allow debtors to reduce their obligations through service rather than cash payments. These opportunities include assignment to work gangs that maintain the establishment's physical infrastructure, participation in enforcement activities that ensure other debtors remain compliant with their obligations, and recruitment of new players whose gambling losses will be credited against existing debts. Each option represents a form of corruption that transforms victims into accomplices in the system that destroyed them. Former gamblers become the establishment's most effective salespeople because their personal experience allows them to identify and manipulate the psychological vulnerabilities that lead others into similar traps. The administrator explains that my specific skills as a corpse starch factory worker make me particularly valuable for assignments involving the disposal of problem debtors whose accounts have been closed through means other than successful repayment. The euphemistic language cannot disguise the reality that I am being recruited to participate in activities that would have horrified me only hours earlier. But the mathematics of my situation leave little room for moral considerations. The debt I have incurred cannot be resolved through any legal means available to someone of my social position and economic circumstances. My choices have been reduced to accepting whatever role the establishment assigns, or facing consequences that extend beyond personal destruction to encompass my family and anyone else connected to my life. This is the final stage of the gambling den's business model, the point where financial extraction gives way to direct control over human resources. Debtors become assets that can be deployed in whatever manner best serves the organization's interests, their previous lives and identities becoming irrelevant beside their utility as tools for generating additional profit. The transformation is not immediate, but rather occurs gradually as debtors are drawn deeper into the establishment's operations through incremental compromises that seem reasonable when considered individually but collectively represent complete moral surrender. I sign the service contract and accept my first assignment, which involves approaching workers at my former job to invite them to visit the Gilded Grox for an evening of entertainment. My personal knowledge of their financial situations and psychological vulnerabilities makes me uniquely qualified to identify those most likely to become profitable long-term customers. The irony is not lost on me that I have become an active participant in the system that destroyed my own life, but this recognition provides no immunity against the practical necessities of my situation. I need to generate sufficient value for the establishment to avoid the more unpleasant alternatives available to debtors who fail to remain productive. As I prepare to leave the den and return to the upper levels where my recruitment activities will take place, I catch a final glimpse of the gaming floor where new players are already taking their seats at tables where yesterday's losers once sat. The cycle continues without interruption, each generation of victims creating the conditions that will entrap the next. The Gilded Grox and establishments like it represent more than mere criminal enterprises. They are symptoms of a broader systemic failure that characterizes life throughout the Imperium. When legitimate opportunities for advancement are systematically denied to entire populations, illegal alternatives inevitably arise to fill the resulting vacuum. But these alternatives do not provide genuine escape from oppressive conditions. Instead, they create new forms of exploitation that are often more efficient and comprehensive than the official systems they supplement. The gambling den offers the illusion of possibility while ensuring that failure remains the overwhelmingly likely outcome for all participants. The true genius of this arrangement lies in its ability to transform social pressure into individual pathology. Rather than recognizing their circumstances as products of systemic injustice, victims interpret their failures as personal inadequacies that justify whatever punishments are subsequently imposed upon them. This psychological manipulation ensures that even those who understand the mathematical impossibility of their situation continue to participate in their own destruction. They cannot admit that the system is rigged without also acknowledging that their earlier decisions were fundamentally irrational, an admission that would undermine their sense of personal agency and competence. As I walk through the service corridors that connect the den to the industrial levels where my new victims await recruitment, I realize that I have become something fundamentally different from what I was when I first descended to sub-level 97. The transformation has been subtle but complete, affecting not only my economic circumstances but my basic identity and moral framework. I am no longer Tharn Yorick, factory worker seeking to improve his family's situation through a calculated risk. I am now an asset owned by the Gilded Grox, my value determined by my effectiveness at identifying and manipulating the same vulnerabilities that led to my own downfall. The psychological techniques I will use to recruit new players are identical to those used on me, because they exploit universal human weaknesses that transcend individual differences in intelligence, education, or moral character. Desperation creates predictable patterns of behavior that can be identified and exploited by those who understand the underlying mechanisms. My first target is Marcus Kellen, a fellow corpse starch worker whose wife recently developed the wasting disease that commonly afflicts those exposed to the chemical preservatives used in food processing. The medical treatment she requires costs more than his annual wages, creating exactly the kind of desperate financial pressure that makes gambling seem like a rational option. I approach him during the meal break when workers gather in the facility's common area to consume their daily rations of the same processed protein we spend our shifts manufacturing. The conversation begins with expressions of sympathy for his wife's condition and gradually shifts toward discussion of alternative income sources that might provide the funds needed for her treatment. The manipulation techniques come naturally, as if they were skills I had possessed all along rather than recently acquired knowledge. I describe the Gilded Grox in terms that emphasize the skill-based aspects of its games while downplaying the mathematical realities that make long-term success impossible. I share carefully edited accounts of my own experiences, focusing on the moments of excitement and temporary success while omitting any mention of the devastating losses that followed. Most importantly, I frame gambling as a form of financial planning rather than entertainment, presenting it as a tool that responsible men use to address serious family obligations. This reframing eliminates the moral objections that might otherwise prevent a devout imperial citizen from participating in activities that the ecclesiarchy officially condemns. Kellen's responses follow predictable patterns that I now recognize from my training in the establishment's recruitment techniques. Initial skepticism gives way to cautious interest as I describe games that seem to offer favorable odds for those with sufficient knowledge and discipline to play them properly. The crucial moment comes when he begins asking specific questions about betting strategies and optimal approaches to particular games. These inquiries represent the transition from passive resistance to active consideration, marking the point where recruitment becomes almost inevitable. I provide just enough information to make gambling seem approachable while ensuring that his actual knowledge remains insufficient to avoid the traps that await inexperienced players. The goal is to create confidence without competence, a psychological state that leads directly to the kind of overreach that generates maximum profit for the house. By the end of our conversation, Kellen has agreed to visit the Gilded Grox the following evening, bringing with him the medical fund that represents his family's only hope for addressing his wife's condition. I have successfully transformed a devoted husband's love for his spouse into a weapon that will be used to destroy them both. The ease with which this manipulation was accomplished disturbs me more than the financial losses I suffered during my own gambling experience. Those losses represented the destruction of assets I had accumulated through years of labor, but this recruitment represents the destruction of innocence and trust that can never be recovered. Yet I cannot allow these moral considerations to interfere with my obligation to the establishment. My debt contract includes specific performance requirements that must be met to avoid penalties that would make my current situation seem pleasant by comparison. The following evening, I returned to sub-level 97 in my new role as a recruitment specialist, escorting Kellen through the same descent that led to my own destruction. The familiarity of the route does nothing to diminish its psychological impact. If anything, returning as an employee rather than a customer makes the den's predatory nature more apparent and disturbing. Kellen's initial reaction to the Gilded Grox mirrors my own experience, but observing it from the outside reveals details that were invisible when I was the one being manipulated. The way his pupils dilate as he takes in the neon-lit gaming floor, the unconscious loosening of his grip on the medical fund credits, the subtle shift in his posture as the establishment's atmosphere begins its psychological work. I guide him to the same chance wheel table where my own destruction began, introducing him to the dealer with the practiced casualness of someone who belongs in this environment. The dealer's recognition of me as a house employee is communicated through glances and gestures invisible to civilian observers, a silent language that coordinates the systematic exploitation about to unfold. Kellen's first few bets are conservative, his natural caution reinforced by the knowledge that he is gambling with money earmarked for his wife's medical treatment. But the wheel's algorithm has been adjusted based on information I provided about his specific psychological profile, ensuring that his initial experience includes just enough success to overcome his reservations. As his confidence grows, I excuse myself to recruit additional targets from among the evening's new arrivals. My assigned quota requires bringing 5 new players per week, each selected for maximum long-term revenue potential based on detailed profiles I compile through workplace surveillance and social manipulation. Tonight's secondary target is Elena Voss, a shift supervisor whose promotion came with access to employee pension funds that she oversees for her department. The temptation to borrow from these accounts to cover gambling losses makes her particularly valuable to the establishment, as her eventual discovery and prosecution will eliminate any inconvenient witnesses while providing additional entertainment for high-stakes players who enjoy wagering on the outcomes of internal investigations. The techniques required to manipulate Voss differ significantly from those used on Kellen, where he responds to appeals to masculine responsibility and protective instincts. She requires validation of her intelligence and sophistication. I present the den's games as intellectual challenges that reward analytical thinking and strategic planning, carefully avoiding any suggestion that luck plays a determining role in outcomes. Her background in financial management makes her more skeptical of obvious mathematical disadvantages, so I focus her attention on games that disguise their true odds through complex rule structures and misleading payout schedules. The key is to overwhelm her analytical capabilities with information while creating time pressure that prevents careful calculation. Within an hour, both Kellen and Voss are fully engaged in gambling activities that will ultimately consume everything they brought to the establishment and leave them vulnerable to the same debt servitude arrangements that now control my existence. The predictability of their behavior patterns confirms the effectiveness of the recruitment methods I have been trained to employ. But even as I successfully fulfill my assignment quotas, I cannot escape the growing awareness that my role in this system makes me complicit in forms of suffering that extend far beyond my own circumstances. Each person I recruit represents not just individual destruction but the collapse of families, the abandonment of children, and the perpetuation of cycles of poverty and desperation that define life in the underhive. The mathematical progression is inexorable. Tonight's victims will become tomorrow's recruitment specialists, their desperation transformed into weapons deployed against their former friends and colleagues. The system expands through geometric progression, each generation of debtors creating multiple new victims who will in turn create still more. This realization forces me to confront the true scope of the Gilded Grox's operations. What I had initially perceived as a localized criminal enterprise revealed itself as a node in a vast network that extends throughout the hive and potentially across multiple worlds within the sector. The high-stakes games conducted in the establishment's private rooms are not mere entertainment for wealthy individuals, but coordination meetings where the expansion of gambling operations is planned and financed. The merchant princes and noble houses that participate in these sessions provide the capital and political protection necessary to establish new facilities in previously untapped populations. The debt servitude contracts signed by individual gamblers serve as both profit centers and recruitment tools for these expansion efforts. Experienced debtors are transferred between facilities as needed to establish operations in new territories, their expertise in manipulation and psychological control making them invaluable assets for penetrating resistant communities. Over the following weeks, my assignments expand beyond simple recruitment to include more sophisticated operations designed to identify and exploit systemic vulnerabilities in imperial institutions. The administratum clerks and military officers who frequent the establishment provide information about personnel changes, policy modifications, and security procedures that can be exploited to expand gambling operations into previously protected areas. My role evolves from recruitment specialist to intelligence coordinator, compiling and analyzing information gathered from multiple sources to identify opportunities for expanding the organization's influence. The skills required for this work are identical to those needed for legitimate administrative positions, but the applications serve purposes that would horrify any loyal imperial citizen. The irony becomes apparent that the establishment's operations require exactly the kind of analytical thinking and strategic planning that imperial doctrine claims to value, but directed toward ends that systematically undermine the social order the Imperium ostensibly exists to protect. The gambling dens represent a parallel administrative structure that operates according to pure efficiency principles, unconstrained by moral or ideological limitations. This efficiency makes them remarkably effective at achieving their objectives, which include not merely profit extraction but the systematic identification and exploitation of weaknesses in imperial governance structures. Every successful gambling operation represents a failure of official institutions to address the underlying conditions that make such enterprises possible. The ecclesiarchy's condemnation of gambling as sinful does nothing to reduce demand for such services, when legitimate opportunities for advancement remain unavailable to entire populations. The Administratum's regulations prohibiting unauthorized financial institutions merely ensure that illegal alternatives operate without oversight or consumer protection. Most significantly, the military's recruitment policies that target desperate populations for hazardous assignments create steady streams of disabled veterans whose pension systems provide predictable revenue sources for establishments that understand how to exploit their particular vulnerabilities. After 3 months of service to the Gilded Grox, I receive an assignment that forces me to confront the ultimate implications of my complicity in this system. Kellen, whose wife died when his gambling losses prevented him from purchasing her medication, has become increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to the organization's operations. My instructions are to arrange his disappearance in a manner that eliminates any possibility of his testimony reaching imperial authorities while providing useful intelligence about potential security vulnerabilities in the corpse starch processing facility where he continues to work. The assignment requires me to betray someone whose destruction I orchestrated, transforming our shared experience of exploitation into a weapon used against him. This represents the final stage of moral corruption that the establishment system is designed to achieve, the point where victims become so thoroughly complicit that retreat becomes psychologically impossible. But as I prepare to implement the operation that will result in Kellen's death, I experience a moment of clarity that pierces through the psychological conditioning that has controlled my behavior for months. The recognition strikes me that I am not trapped by mathematical necessity or economic pressure, but by my own acceptance of the identity the establishment has imposed upon me. The debt contract that supposedly binds me to continued service contains provisions that would allow termination through actions that I have been systematically conditioned to consider impossible. The organization's power over me depends entirely on my continued belief that compliance represents the only viable option for survival. This realization creates a cascade of recognition about the true nature of all the systems of control that define life in the Imperium. The apparent inevitability of oppression and exploitation depends on the victim's acceptance of limited choice sets that exclude options their oppressors cannot afford to acknowledge. The gambling den's business model requires debtors to believe that their circumstances are permanent and their obligations non-negotiable. But this belief system collapses as soon as the underlying assumptions are examined critically rather than accepted as immutable facts. The mathematical analysis I was trained to apply to gambling odds can be directed toward the risk-benefit calculations that govern the establishment's own operations. The organization's apparent invulnerability depends on assumptions about victim behavior that become invalid once victims stop cooperating with their own exploitation. Instead of implementing the operation against Kellen, I begin developing alternative plans that leverage my inside knowledge of the organization's structure and procedures to maximum advantage. The intelligence gathering skills I acquired during my service can be redirected toward identifying vulnerabilities in the establishment's security and operational protocols. The most significant weakness lies in the organization's dependence on information secrecy to maintain its competitive advantages. The high-stakes games that coordinate expansion activities rely on participants' confidence that their communications remain confidential and their activities unmonitored by outside authorities. But my access to the establishment's internal systems includes the capability to document these communications and compile evidence of corruption that extends into the highest levels of hive government and planetary avons. Administration. The merchant princes and noble houses who treat human suffering as entertainment have created records of their activities that could destroy them if presented to appropriate authorities. The challenge lies in identifying those authorities who remain sufficiently isolated from the corruption networks to act upon such evidence without compromising their own positions. The gambling operations have extended their influence throughout the administrative and military hierarchies to ensure protection from conventional enforcement efforts. However, the Imperium's vast bureaucracy includes oversight mechanisms designed to detect and eliminate exactly the kinds of corruption that gambling enterprises represent. The Officio Assassinorum, the Inquisition, and various internal security agencies maintain independent command structures specifically to address threats that compromise local authority structures. My plan requires compiling comprehensive documentation of the gambling network's operations while identifying contact protocols for agencies capable of acting upon such information. This represents a significant escalation in risk, as discovery would result in consequences far more severe than simple debt collection procedures. But the mathematical analysis that governed my gambling behavior suggests that the potential rewards justify the risks involved. The systematic destruction of the gambling network would not only eliminate the specific organization that entrapped me, but would send signals throughout similar enterprises that such operations carry unacceptable long-term costs. The implementation requires patience and careful preparation. I continue fulfilling my assignments while covertly documenting the activities I observe and compiling profiles of key personnel whose elimination would disrupt the organization's operations. The intelligence work I perform for the establishment provides perfect cover for gathering the information needed to destroy it. Over the following months, I develop detailed maps of the gambling network structure, including financial flows, personnel assignments, and communication protocols that connect operations across multiple worlds. The scope of the system far exceeds anything I had initially imagined, encompassing hundreds of establishments and thousands of employees across an entire sector. But this vast scale also creates vulnerabilities that smaller operations could avoid. The coordination required to manage such an extensive network necessitates communication systems that can be monitored and infiltrated by sufficiently sophisticated intelligence operations. The breakthrough comes when I gain access to the private gaming room where strategic planning sessions are conducted by the network's senior management. The participants' assumption that their conversations remain confidential leads them to discuss operations with a candor that provides devastating evidence of their criminal activities. The recordings I compile document not merely illegal gambling operations but systematic corruption of imperial institutions on a scale that threatens the stability of entire subsectors. Military contracts awarded based on gambling outcomes, judicial decisions influenced by debt obligations, and administrative appointments determined by gaming success rather than competence. This evidence establishes clear patterns of heretical behavior that fall within the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, whose authority supersedes all local political considerations. The challenge lies in establishing contact with inquisitorial representatives while avoiding detection by the extensive surveillance systems that protect high-level criminal enterprises. The solution emerges through careful observation of the establishment's customer patterns. Several regular players in the high-stakes games bear subtle markings that suggest affiliation with Imperial intelligence services, their presence indicating ongoing surveillance operations that may provide opportunities for making contact. The approach requires extreme caution, as misidentification could result in exposure to hostile agents who merely pose as Imperial operatives. But careful analysis of behavioral patterns and communication methods eventually allows me to identify individuals whose credentials appear genuine and whose objectives align with my own. The initial contact is established through coded messages embedded in gambling activities, using the establishment's own communication systems to arrange meetings that appear to be routine customer service interactions. The irony of using the gambling den's infrastructure to coordinate its own destruction provides appropriate justice for the manipulation techniques used against its victims. The inquisitorial agents who respond to my communications express initial skepticism about the scope of corruption I describe, but the evidence I have compiled proves sufficiently compelling to trigger a comprehensive investigation. Their resources and authority make possible interventions that individual resistance could never achieve. The operation that follows unfolds with the precision and overwhelming force characteristic of imperial justice when properly directed. Coordinated raids across multiple worlds simultaneously eliminate key personnel and seize documentation that exposes the full extent of the gambling network's operations. The Gilded Grox itself becomes a tomb of twisted metal and scattered credits when targeted explosives destroy the structural supports that maintain the establishment's artificial atmosphere. The few staff members who attempt to resist are eliminated with efficiency that makes clear the futility of opposing imperial authority when it operates without constraint. But the physical destruction of gambling facilities represents only the beginning of a broader campaign to eliminate the conditions that made such enterprises possible. The investigation reveals systematic failures in imperial governance that created opportunities for criminal organizations to flourish in environments that should have been protected. The consequences extend far beyond the punishment of individual criminals to encompass reforms in administrative procedures, military recruitment policies, and economic regulations that address the root causes of population vulnerability to exploitation. These changes represent acknowledgement that security depends not merely on eliminating threats, but on creating conditions where such threats cannot emerge. My own role in this transformation evolves from victim to witness to agent of justice, the progression representing a restoration of agency and moral purpose that the gambling system was designed to eliminate. The skills acquired through exploitation become tools for liberation when directed toward appropriate objectives. The former employees and victims of the gambling network face various fates depending on their levels of complicity and willingness to cooperate with ongoing investigations. Those who provided testimony and evidence receive opportunities for legitimate employment and debt forgiveness that allow them to rebuild their lives according to imperial law. Others, whose actions crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed, face justice proportionate to their crimes. But even these punishments serve constructive purposes by establishing precedents that deter similar activities and demonstrating the Imperium's commitment to protecting its citizens from systematic exploitation. Kellen does not live to see the gambling network's destruction, his death serving as a final reminder of the human costs of allowing such systems to operate unchallenged. But his sacrifice, along with those of countless others who fell victim to institutional indifference and criminal opportunism, provides the moral foundation for changes that will protect future generations. The empty spaces where gambling dens once operated become sites for legitimate businesses that provide actual opportunities for economic advancement without exploitation. The transformation of these locations from centers of despair into sources of genuine hope represents the most fitting memorial possible for those who suffered under the previous system. As I walk through the reconstructed areas of Sub-Level 97, now illuminated by honest lighting that reveals both beauty and decay without deception, I reflect on the nature of the choices that determine individual and collective fate. The gambling den's power depended entirely on its victims' acceptance of false limitations and artificial scarcity that served others' interests. The broader lesson extends far beyond specific criminal enterprises to encompass all systems of oppression that depend on psychological manipulation rather than legitimate authority. The Imperium's strength lies not in its ability to suppress dissent, but in its capacity to address the conditions that make dissent necessary. True loyalty cannot be extracted through fear or purchased through false promises, but must be earned through institutions that serve the genuine interests of those they claim to protect. The gambling dens represented a failure of this fundamental principle, their destruction marking a return to authentic imperial values. The corruption that allowed such enterprises to flourish continues to exist in other forms and locations throughout the galaxy, but the precedent established by their elimination provides both warning and inspiration for those who encounter similar challenges. The mathematical certainty that oppression generates resistance applies as surely to criminal organizations as to any other system that depends on systematic exploitation. In the end, the gambling dens of the Underhive served as a microcosm of larger struggles that define existence throughout the Imperium. Their rise and fall demonstrates both the vulnerability of human nature to manipulation and the ultimate power of human agency when directed toward justice rather than personal advantage. The credits I once wagered on impossible odds have been replaced by investments in possibilities that serve purposes beyond my own survival. The desperation that drove me into the Gilded Grox has been transformed into determination to ensure that others need never face similar choices between dignity and survival. This transformation represents the most valuable outcome of my experience, the recognition that suffering becomes meaningful only when it generates understanding that serves purposes beyond the immediate circumstances that created it. The gambling den's legacy lies not in the wealth it extracted or the lives it destroyed, but in the knowledge it provided about the mechanisms of exploitation and the methods of resistance. As the Underhive's industrial machinery resumes its eternal rhythm, powered now by workers who face the future with genuine hope rather than desperate gambling, the lessons learned from the gambling dens continue to resonate through decisions large and small that shape the character of Imperial civilization. The mathematics of human behavior remain constant, but their application can serve justice as effectively as they once served exploitation. In this equation lies both the promise and the responsibility of all who would build a future worthy of the sacrifices made to achieve it. The story of Tharn Yorich ends where it began, with a choice that carries consequences extending far beyond individual circumstance. But the nature of that choice has been transformed by experience, from desperate gambling to purposeful action, from seeking escape to creating possibility, from serving exploitation to serving justice. This transformation represents the true victory over the systems that seek to reduce human beings to sources of profit rather than recognizing them as bearers of potential that extends beyond any calculation of immediate utility. In the end, the gambling dens fell not to superior force but to the recognition that their victims possessed agency they had temporarily forgotten but never truly lost. The Gilded Grox stands empty now, its neon signs dark and its promises revealed as the lies they always were. But in its place rises something more valuable than any jackpot it ever offered: the knowledge that dignity cannot be wagered away, and that justice, unlike luck, can be created through intelligent action directed toward worthy purposes. This knowledge spreads through the Underhive like light penetrating darkness, illuminating possibilities that were always present but temporarily obscured by the manipulations of those who profit from others' despair. In recognizing these possibilities and acting upon them, the former victims of the gambling dens achieve a form of victory that no game of chance could ever provide. The true odds were never what they seemed to be. The house advantage was never as insurmountable as its operators claimed, and the choice between submission and resistance was never as clear-cut as either oppressor or victim believed. In this recognition lies the foundation for changes that extend far beyond the elimination of a single criminal enterprise to encompass the transformation of the conditions that made such enterprises possible. The mathematics of hope prove more powerful than the mathematics of despair, but only for those wise enough to calculate the true odds and courageous enough to act upon their understanding. In the end, this courage transforms victims into agents of justice and gambling dens into monuments to the power of human agency properly directed.